Okay, so I'm just going to throw a bunch of ideas out there, food for thought. The idea of great storytelling and figurative art, it's just sort of an umbrella term, I suppose, for a lot of the paintings that I will be showing you that I think are great compositions. I'll also be showing you some that I think are not so great. You'll get the idea. So this sculpture is the Laocoon. They think it's from about 30 BC, and it's about the Trojan War. The priest Laocoon tried to warn the Trojans not to trust Greeks bearing gifts, the Trojan horse, but he was struck down by a god who sent snakes to kill him and his sons. So this was long talked about. Pliny talked about it as just the perfect sculpture. Later on, Winckelmann and others talked about it as a kind of perfect example of the Hellenistic Baroque, which is basically the Greek style. And Lessing is a German philosopher, contemporary of Winckelmann, who wrote an essay called Laocoon, The Limits of Poetry and Painting. He was trying to define how visual art is different from poetry, or what today we would say, literature. Some of the things he says about visual art is that the demands of beauty can't be reconciled with pain and all its disfiguring violence. Distress should be transformed through beauty into the tender feeling of pity. And I think today we'd probably say empathy. He also says visual art is supposed to be contemplated repeatedly and at length, unlike poetry, which is linear. So the moment depicted has to be chosen carefully to, as he puts it, convey what has led up to that moment and all possible outcomes for the viewer to imagine. And he's saying that the Laocoon really does that. The artist, there are three sculptors that they think sculpted it, is showing the moment before the scream or before death so that the narrative is completed in the mind of the viewer. In the Renaissance, we can think of composition as kind of complicated. Some people think of it like planning. Others think of it more like improvising or editing as you paint. Western painting was the Bible of the illiterate, so we can thank that idea, which I think Gregory the Great, the Pope, is the one who made that a thing, because it's very different from the other Abrahamic faiths, Islam and Judaism, which do not encourage depictions of people, or especially of God. In Islam, that's still, we know with Charlie Hebdo, it's still a tender issue. But because of that, we have loads and loads of paintings to enjoy. So Renaissance viewers would be able to read basically the iconography, which is the subject matter. They'd look at these two paintings. They would know that they are paintings of mother and child. And they could also understand, meaning the Madonna, and then they could also understand size, that the largest figure would be the most important, placement, the most centrally located figure, and also the one highest up would be the most important, from the earthbound to the heavenly. So that idea of hierarchy. And they might have understood, everybody would understand that gold was really a good thing, so it indicated wealth. It wouldn't be later until Vasari would push the idea that making the imitation of gold, which you'll see in a Titian painting, is more impressive than putting actual gold in a painting. There's still a lot of people that would argue with that because everybody knows gold is valuable. So it's here in the background as a kind of sacred realm. And it also has in the halos, but you can see there's still a hierarchy of things that are lower down on the picture plane being more earthly, and as they move up, you'll see that in several paintings, it's moving toward heaven. Just a little bit about Giotto. That's 1310, that painting. The one on the right is Italo-Byzantine style. So basically after the fall of Rome in the Dark Ages, the Byzantine Empire kind of went along with this idea of iconic painting, which is that it sort of still exists in Buddhism today and other traditions, African sculpture, where you keep making something the same way and you're keeping the past alive by doing that. But in certain periods of history, the Bronze Age collapse is one, the Renaissance is another, the idea of innovation becomes popular, and the powers that be, the patrons, actually like that and they encourage it. So that happened in the Renaissance. In Italy, the way, and this is still true today, the word disegno means both design and drawing. So it's very different from the way we think about it in the 20th century. And also the word forma means both shape and volume. So if you're drawing something, you're describing it. If you're placing something, you're also describing it, and you're thinking about how flat or volumetric it's going to be. So the idea of convex or concave shapes is something that painting can really take advantage of. Sculpture is really three-dimensional, so it's a different story. This one on the left by Masolino, who was Masaccio's teacher, you can see how he makes this mandorla shape out of angels. And he has a little bit of spatial recession, that he has really small angels in there who are presumably farther back in space. There's still the gold background, and there's God the Father welcoming Mary. This painting is the Assumption of the Virgin into heaven. So anybody looking at this would kind of know at the time what the story was. The mandorla shape that Masolino shows just means almond in Italian, but it's basically, this convex shape. You can see a sort of primitive example here. You still see it on the Lady of Guadalupe. I used to have a bumper sticker with this image. It's the same thing. There's the mandorla around her. But you can see certain artists, when, innovation, they had patrons that would encourage innovation. You can see the painting in the middle. This one is by Masolino and Masaccio, and you can see the idea of the Immaculate Conception is inferred in it, or implicated, because the Immaculate Conception really refers to Mary's mother, Anne. In order for Jesus to be immaculately conceived, his mother, they decided at some point, the church nerds, no disrespect intended, but got together at some council. They had a convention, and they decided, well, actually, Mary would have to be immaculately conceived in order for Jesus to be. So it really refers directly to Anne, and you can see the body of Christ, or the baby Jesus, sort of inside the convex form of Mary, and also inside the form of Anne. And then there's no mandorla, but there's this kind of cloth that mediates between convex and concave. It's just a really great composition. And I forgot to mention that blue was a valuable pigment. Maybe not people that just went to church to hear sermons would know how valuable it was, but patrons definitely would know that it came from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli, and it was reserved for the Virgin. This is a painting by Piero, and so you could sort of think of the Immaculate Conception kind of being, again, like slightly implicated by, here she is del parto, so Madonna pregnant, and then she's sort of in a almond kind of shaped tent, or it sort of looks like, anyway, you could think about it, it's also related to anatomy. But it's just kind of a curious structure, and it's something that Piero came up with. So convex shapes in painting, they push against the rectangle, they have visual power. And here we're going to jump to Michelangelo. I'm going to be jumping all around the place historically. You can see this robe behind God the Father in the creation of Adam is very convex. And actually there's recently a doctor wrote an article about how it looks like the shape of a brain. And that might sound far-fetched, but you have to realize at this time, this is when they were sort of doing the devil's work. It would have been considered the devil's work a few centuries before, but to cut up bodies and study them. And Leonardo especially, look at him, he's reimagining how these, desiccated anatomical forms would look when they're back alive, pretty strange, but it's kind of amazing that it went so quickly modern in a way from the Dark Ages, so-called. You can also see this figure on the Sistine Chapel, how it's also very convex. And Michelangelo is really kind of thinking like a sculptor. If you look at most of his paintings, there's almost no background. It's kind of funny if you think about it. He didn't really want to paint the Sistine ceiling, and so he's really thinking like a sculptor, and he's putting what he has to in the background. This is one of his disegnos, so here you can see it's a design for it looks like an oil-burning lamp. So he's describing it while he's also showing the design for it, so again, disegno. And by the way, the idea of a background, just Marcel Duchamp was asked why he painted on a big glass, the large glass in Philadelphia. And he said, well, I can never figure out what to do in the background, which is pretty funny, really. In other words, you can just move it anywhere and you have an automatic background. Anyway, that's just kind of I think he was a lot funnier, maybe didn't expect to be taken as seriously as he was. So Giacometti and Munch are also taking advantage of this idea of convex versus concave shapes. In Giacometti, this dog the negative shapes have a lot of form, they have a lot of volume. And that sort of makes you could say, anti-heroic the dog look kind of like it's being withered down by the space around it. And Munch over here, this painting he called Puberty, so that's a bizarre threshold, right, between childhood and adulthood, and you can see parts of her are kind of spindly, parts of her are becoming convex as she's turning into a woman, and then she has this sort of really bizarre, kind of creepy, super convex shadow, issuing behind her kind of portentously. So it's just the visual language can be partly how you tell the story. But again, Western painting, because of the Bible of the illiterate, it has a lot of focus on the body, and that's because the major story of Christianity is the Passion, and that was St. Paul's idea, basically, was to make this the story that would really sell the religion. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because it's all about suffering and sacrifice, so everybody can relate to it, or most people. It helped grow the religion. And so here's a Grunwald, 1515 on the left, and you can just see this sort of tortured body of Christ. And then this is at the Met. Most of you have probably seen it. It's the Van Eyck Last Judgment on the right, with all these humans suffering and being tortured basically down here. And then another torture scene, the crucifixion. So you can imagine how Christian artists would have related to things like the Laocoon, because it is telling a story of torture and death. Like so many stories about Jesus are. You can see how Michelangelo was very influenced by this sculpture, Greek sculpture. This is the torso of Belvedere, which is in the Vatican. And in 1527, I think it was Charles V, but the Spanish armies, the Habsburgs, invaded Italy, and after that you get sort of the end of the High Renaissance. That's when really the Spanish Inquisition kicks in, Council of Trent, Counter-Reformation, where they're really, really strict about what can be depicted in art. And they actually, I'll show you some examples of what they recommended, which is something Lessing would disagree with. But at any rate, you can see, and during that sack of Rome, the torso was damaged. But you can see how it really influenced Michelangelo. So in a way, if you think about, a very simple way to think about the High Renaissance, I think, is they wanted to make their paintings look like Greek sculpture, some of the artists. So here's another example of how much things jumped. This is Duccio, 1311, and this is Leonardo's Vitruvian Man of 1490. So it's about over 150 years. In the early Renaissance, the life expectancy was 30 years. The plague of 1346, a third of the European population died. So kind of like the Bronze Age collapse too, people think it was a time for like a big do-over. There was a lot of death, people saw a lot of death, and they wanted to change and do things differently. And so maybe that's why people have speculated that there was so much innovation in art and things changed so much. Maybe they wanted to see healthy, kind of athletic bodies, because the body of Christ in a lot of paintings looks kind of like an athlete. Not the Grunwald, not in the North where those Greek those classical values didn't really arrive, but definitely in a lot of Italian art, Spanish, and then later the Grand Manner art. So in a way to think about, basically, the body started to be thought of in terms of math-based proportion, and that's something we take, we all think of like a head is like, a body is 8 heads tall or something like that. But really, there isn't really any reason. Vitruvius was a Roman architect who thought about correspondences between human anatomy and proportions and buildings. But that doesn't exist really in any other major thought system in the world. And again, we're so used to it, it seems normal, but if you think about it, it's actually kind of strange. It's still handy and I still use it, but it's really this idea of an ideal type. And of course, the Greeks, they had the Olympics, people competed in the nude, so you could see what a really athletic body looked like, naked. Everybody could see that, so no wonder they made sculptures about it. They all valued that. You can see here this Leonardo, Madonna of the Rocks, and the Pietà by Michelangelo, how influenced they were by the Greek model, or I should say the classical model, because a lot of these are Roman copies of small Greek bronzes which were melted down and disappeared. Leonardo warned against melodrama. This is something this is from a really great book, Michael Baxendale, Painting Experience in 15th Century Italy. I'm on my third time reading it. It's really good. He said, "Some days ago I saw the picture of an angel who, in making the Annunciation, seemed to be trying to chase Mary out of the room, with movements showing the sort of attack one might make on some hated enemy. Mary, as if desperate, seemed to be trying to throw herself out of the window. Do not fall into errors like these." Which is pretty funny. And I believe that Baxendale thought he was talking about this painting by Botticelli. So, I love Botticelli, but maybe his religious paintings are not his best. He was a Neoplatonist. I don't know if that had anything to do with it. But it is kind of overly dramatic. And then this painting on the right is also Botticelli. It's the Lamentation. People would have known it's the Lamentation and not the Pietà because everybody's lamenting. Basically, everybody is crying. The way you see mourners publicly mourn. Everybody, there's lots of diagonals, lots of curves, lots of strong color. It's just kind of a bit too much. It's kind of absurd to be criticizing it, Botticelli, but I think you know what I mean, So here's some versions of St. Mary Magdalene, some of whom I think Lessing would like, and Leonardo. I think the two on the left by Caravaggio and Donatello he would like, and the other four, I think he might find them just a little overwrought. And so it's something to think about. A lot of it is what moment of the story was chosen, what was emphasized, what is de-emphasized. I think in the cases of these two, the gesture is a little off. Robert Hughes said that that Caravaggio was a master of the gesture. And I think it really makes a lot of sense. Here, maybe her head's a little too far back. She looks like she's kind of daydreaming. And then this gesture doesn't really look that the weight is not convincing. And then these two are really beautifully painted, but they just sort of, what are these people thinking about? It's hard to relate to. There may be, I'll talk about that in a minute. Lessing also said, transitory images of unrestrained emotion, pleasant or terrible, take on an unnatural appearance when translated into art. Their repeated contemplation serves to weaken the impression. In the end, we recoil in horror or loathing. I don't know if we quite do that, but he's sort of warning, like Leonardo did, about, choosing moments that are too kind of transitory, too non-serious, This one on the left is a painting that's in St. Stefano da Rotondo in Rome, and it's a Counter-Reformation painting that was really encouraged by the powers that be to get people to, it's kind of weird in the Counter-Reformation, when the Reformation took away a large part of the Catholic, you could say, business market, clientele, whatever, that instead of sort of going in that direction of restraint that Protestantism was arguing for, the Catholic Church went in the opposite direction, and they really doubled down on this kind of theatrical painting, theatrical sculpture. Baroque churches are very theatrical. And it might have been a way to really just kind of pull people in. There wasn't a lot going on in your town back then, going to church on the weekend and hearing a sermon. There weren't books you couldn't read. Maybe at this time there were, but you'd get a lot of stimulation from going to church. So it was a way to pull people in. And then here's Mao, smiling with children. So this is the kind of thing, agitprop, it's a transitory emotion. It's just not, we might say it's not convincing. However, the idea of kitchen irony are still very popular. This is on the left. This is two painters or artists, Komar and Malamud. I won't go off on a tangent, but there's a painting of George Washington with the baby eagle, the American eagle. So it's sort of like a Madonna and Child thing. Then it's Kurt Cowper's Cary Grant, running nude somewhere. And then in the middle of this is the contemporary Chinese painter Min Jun. I hope I'm saying that right. And perhaps because there is a lot of censorship in China, Winnie the Pooh, you can Google that, Winnie the Pooh censored in China. It's an interesting story. So maybe it's a way to kind of be a little bit provocative or, sardonic regarding the politics of China with these laughing faces. And then John Curran, who makes everybody look ridiculous, but does it in a really, really good, excellent way. So you can make paintings about silly moments. You can make paintings about silly things, about transitory moments. So it really depends what story you're telling. So this is a painting about the scream. This is Munch. And on the left, this is a painting about a laugh. But they're, of course, vehicles for, in Munch's case, to really show a kind of raw emotion of being a human, and the difficulties of that. And then in Boccioni's case, trying to, nowadays it's hard for us to imagine what it was like, but trying to put the idea of sound and movement and time into painting, into a static image. So what the futurists were trying to do is actually really interesting. It maybe hasn't dated that well because we have so many amazing technologies today. So back to the Laocoon. It was lost for about 1,500 years, and then in 1506, it was dug up in a Roman vineyard. And Michelangelo was present because he was connected to the guy who was the San Gallo, the architect of the Vatican. And later on, he was the one that figured out the correct arm for the missing arm. This top of the arm, of the right arm of Laocoon, or no, the entire arm was missing, and actually Raphael was in charge of a contest. So there was rivalry, but Leonardo was like 20 years older than Michelangelo, who was about 20 years older than Raphael. I mean, it's interesting, they all, crossed paths often and worked around each other. So in this case, Raphael turned out to be wrong, and maybe it's because Michelangelo had a better understanding of gesture and how to tell the story powerfully. He sculpted the David before the Laocoon was dug up. So people heard, they read about the Laocoon, but they didn't know what it looked like. And when it was dug up, the guy San Gallo says this is the Laocoon because he was so familiar with the descriptions. It might have been buried to protect it from the Vandals when Rome was being sacked, right after the fall of Rome. So they held a contest for which arm was correct. Michelangelo basically voted for something like this, but this is the one that Raphael chose. In the early 20th century, some antiquarian or archaeologist was looking in a workyard, and he found an arm that he thought looked like the Laocoon. He brought it to the Vatican. It was in Vatican storage for about 50 years. And then one day somebody brought it out, and they held it up to the Laocoon, and it fit perfectly. All the where it was put together was aligned perfectly. So, Michelangelo understands how to tell a good story. In his David, he's really showing the contemplative moment before he takes action. And those are things that contemplation and action were valued in the Renaissance. It probably because of the medieval, monks and everything they did, the extreme, wonderful nerdiness of them. But back in the Greek days, from what I've read, Michael Sennett, Flesh and Stone, to be kind of off by yourself reading alone in the Greek in Athens was considered kind of weird. You weren't really a contender. You had to keep your body warm. They had this thing about temperature, and you needed to keep your body warm. And women were colder because they menstruated, so they were inferior, and men were better because they were warmer. So anyway, it's a really good book. That's another one, Michael Sennett, Flesh and Stone, really, really good. But by the time you get to the Renaissance, the idea of contemplation and action together are valued, and Michelangelo seems to have told the story really beautifully. This other face, can anybody guess whose that is? Here we have a little audience participation. Yeah, the David, but whose David is this face? Who? Bernini, yes, good, Bernini. So there's Bernini, you can see it's really in the round, it's not, some sculptures will have a more frontal view. A lot of it depends what they're commissioned for. Sometimes they're for a niche. But in this case, it's really all the way around. I mean, this sculpture is wild when you think, David too, Michelangelo too, but no electricity, carved by hand, and he did it like in his 20s. If you go to the Borghese Gallery, the sculptures that Bernini did are just amazing. So it's really all about action in a way. Caravaggio tells a story a little bit more like, I would argue, Michelangelo, where he's thinking about the gravity of the moment, the expression on his face. However, he does sort of Caravaggio makes a joke. He puts his self-portrait on Goliath's head. But it's a graver kind of telling of the story. Reni, on the other hand, it's also a beautiful painting, but it's a little bit more, he's, showing off his trophy in a way. The contrapposto, the pose is sort of, jocular in a way. So they're all good, but just tell the story differently. These paintings, so sometimes you go and you see a painting. This one on the left is in the Pantheon in Paris, which is a great commission. Anybody that got that commission was very successful in their day. I didn't write their name down. That means nothing. I just didn't have time. But I think you can see, this is an example of someone who has an amazing technical ability. Look at how all these parts, everything is painted amazingly well. But it just doesn't really pack a lot of an emotional wallop because in a way it's a little too theatrical. There's a little bit too much going on all over the place. The story, and you don't know, was he commissioned? Did someone say to him, I want you to paint the story of St. Denis, who after he was beheaded, he picked up his head? Was he told that this was the scene, or did he come up with that, the artist himself? In any case, it's still a very accomplished painting, but if we haven't heard of it, that might be one reason, that it's just the story is not as well told as others. That's kind of my main point, because there's a lot of technical facility out there. Same with this painting. I mean, it's almost kind of funny in the way these people are reacting, even though they're both really beautifully painted. So I think both Leonardo and Lessing would agree with Gary Wills, who wrote this book, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and in it he argues that Lincoln's speech is classic art, and he defines it this way. He says it's about compression, grasp of the essential, balance, ideality, awareness of the deepest polarities in a situation, compactness, and suppression of particulars. It's just really interesting. I mean, this is something I struggle with in my own work all the time, this idea of suppression of particulars, because that idea of sacrificing things to get the main emotional point across, to be the most moving, is something that's hard to be objective about. Certain people like Caravaggio just seem to really be good at it. So the iconography, people looking at this, they would have known that it was a painting of St. Jerome, the red cloak that he's writing. Again, back then, not everyone could write. Well, actually, I'm not really sure about that. Forget that. But you can see that, and also the skull was another attribute of St. Jerome. And he puts them sort of on the same plane, which is also metaphorically pretty powerful. Pretty blank background, just the shine on this skull and then this skull, both have cloth underneath. It's also almost kind of amusing as well. Here's two, one is by Rembrandt on the right, Sacrifice of Isaac, and one on the right, left by Caravaggio. Because of the Reformation, you don't see a lot of really big, beautiful religious paintings. Just imagine if Rembrandt, he did Night Watch, which was fantastic, but what if he had been commissioned with giant paintings like that for churches? It would have been nice, but oh well. He still left a lot of great stuff. I think Caravaggio does a great job of suppressing the particulars. So this is the crucifixion of St. Peter, who asked to be crucified upside down because he was embarrassed that he had denied Christ 3 times. He was like, oh, I don't know the guy. He didn't want to get in trouble. So he felt ashamed. So when he was finally caught, he asked to be crucified upside down. So here's the moment of his crucifixion. If you Google paintings of St. Peter, you'll see a lot of this lifting up the cross. But what's really, I think, impactful about Caravaggio is how he suppresses the identities of these people. You definitely feel their bodies pulling, in this case lifting. This moment is kind of humorous. And then you also, so you have all the focus on his head. So he's really saying, hey, viewer, if you're going to contemplate this, really think about that. And just that it's like perfectly between resistance and acceptance. So it's just tragically told really, really well. I think in the Rembrandt, it's also a beautiful painting, but I especially love just the body, what the body says, the vulnerability. It's one of those bizarre stories, the sacrifice of Isaac, that when you hear it when you're little, you're just like, it's like a story problem in math, like it makes no sense psychologically. But anyway, also a strong painting. Here are 2 paintings by de Ribera. An amazing painter. I saw a big show of his in Naples. He's Spanish, but he worked in Naples, like a giant painting, almost like as big as that whole wall of, I think, Sisyphus, or whoever was getting their liver pecked out. I don't know if that was Sisyphus, but I might be mixing stuff up. These are both of this is St. Philip and this is St. Bartholomew. St. Philip was crucified, Bartholomew was flayed. Here's somebody that's starting to peel him. And I think in a way his handling of the body is really magnificent. It's just amazing. He understands anatomy, expression. I mean, I think it's just fantastic. But he has a lot of extraneous parts that are just kind of distracting, especially this guy, the strong red. So I think in terms of compositional organization, he's just not as great as Caravaggio. And it's why the Italians think Caravaggio is so great, even though you can go into lots of Baroque churches in Rome and see amazing paintings that are these amazing painters you've never heard of, but they just can't really tell a story as well as Caravaggio can. Here are two, these are group compositions, so again, it really depends what story you're telling, if it's something made up, and of course the means, I didn't go into it, but the kind of emphasis on color and that are in paintings like Boccioni and the Scream are not really an issue back then when color was kind of limited by the technology of the time for large paintings. But in these, it's Jericho is Raft of the Medusa, and Rubens is The Fall of the Damned. So there's no protagonist in these. These are all just people that are bodies that are suffering, So I think the fact that they're both fantastic paintings, but there isn't the onus of trying to focus, telling a story with a lot of people in it, but having the focus be on the right people. Here's a case where Raphael achieves that. So here he's using the new technology of perspective. Well, it had been around, so 1504, it had been around for about 75 years by that time. And he's using the vanishing point, which is always really powerful in one-point perspective. He's putting the two protagonists there, Plato and, or maybe it's Socrates and Aristotle. I think it's Plato. And then he has other people in it. He put Michelangelo as Heraclitus. But it's really just well organized. He's using it's a huge mob of people, but he's using that perspective to really organize. In this painting by Perugino, 1481, so it's earlier, the story is of Christ giving the keys to St. Peter. So Peter also means rock, so upon this rock I will build my church, St. Peter's, it's also his name. So that's kind of what that's about. And you can see that Perugino puts the two main characters in the front, and they're underneath the church, which is presiding literally and figuratively over this scene. All of the orthogonals converge into the church. So he's using a kind of hierarchical composition along with perspective. Here are two amazing paintings, Masaccio, 1424, so closer to the beginning of perspective. And he's also combining, both of these combine hierarchy with more advanced methods. So he has, lowest down is a painting of a skeleton. This is a fresco. And then as you go farther up, there are two patrons, and you can see they're outside the more inner sanctum of where the holy figures that have halos are. So they're outside that, and then you ascend further, you have Mary and John, then you have the figure of Christ, and then on a ledge behind, you have God the Father. But of course, it's taking place in classical architecture, which is kind of interesting. And the vanishing point is at the viewer's eye level at the foot of the cross. So it also places you're also below, all this important stuff going on. The Venetian Renaissance happened later than in Rome, and Leonardo spent some time in Venice, and they think he influenced Giorgione, especially chiaroscuro with the light and shadow. And Titian is just amazing with that. So he's also using a hierarchical situation. This is, again, the Madonna being assumed into heaven. There's a lower level of just regular people. I'm not sure who those people are. They could be important, I don't know. But they're below the Madonna, who is below God the Father, and you can see there's no actual gold, but there is the illusion of gold of a bright shining golden light, and God he's backlit, so you can't really see him, which is so interesting, right? Because there is something in the Bible, you can't really see the face of God, something like that. So, he's like standing right in front of the sun, so or flying right in front of the sun, so you can't really see him. And here's some examples. Again, I mean, it's kind of absurd. I would be happy to own any of these two paintings. But in a way, the perspectival drama of the environment is a little overwhelming. So especially The Vanishing Point. This is another good book, John White, The Birth and Rebirth of Pictorial Space. And The Vanishing Point can sort of puncture the picture plane, is what he talks about. And he says that certain painters like Filippo Lippi really figured out a way to pull your eye up to the picture plane to prevent that from happening. So here, Lippi has a column, and here he has a bunch of flowers. So it prevents that, it balances that dramatic spatial recession. Here, I think it's really not very balanced, and it sort of takes away, it's a pretty somber, you can see she's accepting, this is the story of the Annunciation, and her gesture signifies that she's accepting her mission. Oops. And then this is Perugino. I think that just he kind of got into it, doing perspective, but I think it's a little overwhelming, this like really intense spatial recession up here. So it's a little bit kind of awkward. It's not as well melded as like the School of Athens. This I think, is a great painting, George Tooker, 1956, called Government Bureau. So it's a low viewpoint. The vanishing point is about here, about there. And you can see that all the figures look pretty anonymous, the government workers and also the people. So it's a kind of anti-humanist, anti-human power, which again is sort of implied in a way by convex form. Also, I maybe didn't mention this, but even in Michelangelo's sculpture of David, even though he's very slender, you can see there are a lot of overlapping convex forms, so he looks robust even though he's very slender. And that's something that sculptors do and painters do as well. You can see it in Rubens very clearly, for example. Here, so it's kind of dehumanizing, and it's similar to what Giacometti does again with space, where space is more powerful than form. This is a Piero's flagellation, and it's very mysterious. People aren't really sure who these figures in the foreground are, but he doesn't have any kind of hierarchy. In fact, in terms of scale or placement, Jesus Christ is being flagellated. He's smaller than the figures in the front, and he's back in the space. And there's some, if you can Google and read, there's a long Wikipedia article that's really interesting about who these people might be, and they might be people in the contemporary Urbino. At any rate, but he manages to tell the narrative in a kind of indirect way that's pretty poetic. I mean, there are other things that he does with color, et cetera, that are powerful. Here are two examples of the way the conversion of St. Paul is told. That's about when Saul was on his way to Damascus, and he heard a voice telling him, to become Paul and spread the word, and he fell off his horse and obeyed that directive. So here Caravaggio has just three figures. He has the horse, his attendant, and then Saul is on the ground, having his revelation, becoming Paul. And if you think about it, it's kind of a strange composition. The horse takes up about 2/3 of it. And then the figure at the bottom is very vulnerable. He's on his stomach. And then look what he does with the horse's foot. It looks a little threatening. He also does another sort of humorous Caravaggio thing he makes the attendant's legs line up with the horse's legs. But he also, you can see his face. He's not looking at us, going like, with an extreme expression or anything. He's kind of subdued, so all the attention is really here. So in a way, you could almost think of the horse as kind of a metaphor, not a symbol, but maybe a metaphor for of the overpowering experience that Saul is undergoing. On the other hand, here, this is a very different tradition, Bruegel in the north, again, where this idea of math-based anatomical, Rubens totally got into it, but Rubens spent a lot of time in Italy. But for those who didn't, the figures are a little bit more organic. They're not this heroic classical proportions. And Bruegel has the same story, but he has this huge epic, really deep space landscape, and then there's right there the guy in blue, that's Saul falling off his horse. So it's kind of, it's like saying all this stuff is going on, and here's this one momentous event that was happening, but still there's all this other stuff going on. And he does a similar thing in this painting on the right of the landscape with the fall of Icarus. So there's a farmer plowing, there's a shepherd gathering wool, ships sailing, and then down there you see Icarus falling into the water. So again, it's this sort of idea. It's huge historical events, but it's subsumed within this giant view of how large the world is, I guess. Or anyway, I won't go off on a tangent there, but it's interesting to think about what he's going for. And then this one on the left is The Spinners by Velázquez. So he's telling the story of the spinning, which will turn into the tapestries that are in the background. He's like he's reversed the space. So this is the kind of more formal presentation up here of tapestries. He's telling the story from behind the spinners who are making the tapestries. So the kind of, the upstairs, downstairs idea of telling it from the insignificant actor's point of view. And then, of course, this painting, Las Meninas, which many people say is one of the greatest, or maybe the greatest painter. I know there was a survey of art historians, and most of them agreed upon this one. For a long time, it was called La Familia. And Velázquez, he wasn't just the court painter, he was also the palace chamberlain. And he also went on trips into Italy and also other parts of Europe to buy paintings for Philip IV. And some of the paintings that he bought became a part of the Prado collection. So he was sort of like, before there were curators, he was kind of a curator. So probably some of these paintings back here are famous paintings that are now in the Prado. The room that he's painting in was the son, Philip IV's son died of, I think, hemophilia. And he gave that room to Velázquez as his studio, which is an interesting way. And Velázquez and the king were very close, so they could hang out together while he was painting. It was a way for him to be in his son's room in a kind of nice, reinvented way. And so, we look at this painting, we're like, okay, what's going on? It's kind of a portrait of this girl. She seems to be posing. And then we notice Velázquez, and he's painting a big painting. So what is he painting? Is he painting her, and she's looking in a mirror, and he's looking at that mirror? I mean, maybe, but that seems kind of odd. Like, why would he paint her backwards in a mirror? But everybody's looking out that way. This is very important. You can see the strong value contrast back here, and that's an actual person. I can't remember who. He's about to close the curtain. So, and what this does is it distracts you, so you don't really notice this right away. And it's a mirror on the back wall, and if you look at it closely, it is the King and Queen of Spain. So then you realize, eventually, okay, he's working on a painting of the King and Queen of Spain, and they're standing where we are, because he's looking at us, so he's also looking at them. And they're standing, everyone in the picture is looking at the king and queen. So when you look at this painting, you're the king and queen of Spain, basically. So it's just really ingenious. And at the time, there was what's the famous Cervantes, Don Quixote, it had these sort of like, not magic realism, but sort of twists, different ways of looking at things. So they think he was probably influenced by that. Anyway, that's just my take on why some paintings are better than others. Are there any questions?